Hey guys, it's Courtney and welcome to day number 5 with the Simon Says Stamp Card Kit for September 2018. I am starting with a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I am stamping with Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink, and I just took my finger there and wiped off some of the ink where those little dots are for the sand. I don't want there to be any sand here. And I stamped that towards the top of my card panel. Here I have a piece of acetate. First I'm going to mask my little mermaid, and I'm also going to take a piece of Post-it note tape and mask out the top portion of my card just underneath her, underneath the little rock that she's sitting on. And I'm just lining that up the best I can. I'm not using my grid mat or anything. Next, I'm going to stamp my image right onto this acetate. It's extremely slippery, so up and down, that's all you want to do. You don't want to move it around too much. Then I'll flip that acetate over and lay that right on my card panel right underneath her, upside down, and just take my finger and again press that very lightly and evenly so it doesn't slide around too much. Next, I'll take a Distress Oxide, Stormy Sky, Tumbled Glass, and Faded Jeans, and I'll be doing some ink blending there on the bottom portion of my card, going directly over this image, concentrating my darkest color being on the bottom, which is the Faded Jeans, working my way up with the Stormy Sky, and then I'll finish that off with the Tumbled Glass and blend that all out. Next, for the sky, I'm going to remove that Post-it note tape, and I had a little bit of trouble here. It kept tearing up my mask a little bit. I'm out of Simon Says Stamp masking paper, which is my favorite masking paper, so next best thing is the Eclipse, but sometimes you have a little bit of hard time making that stick. I'll be using Squeezed Lemonade, Carved Pumpkin, Picked Raspberry, and Wilted Violet. Or is this Seedless Preserves? It might be. I'll link it below. I took a fresh piece of masking paper, or the Post-it note tape, because my oxides are a little bit wet still. Sometimes you'll have a hard time getting that to stick. So I'm starting with the Squeezed Lemonade here just in the center. Then I am blending that out on either side with the Carved Pumpkin. Then I'll move on to the Picked Raspberry and then the Wilted Violet on either side. This looks terrible right now. It will look terrible the first time you go around. You got to go over it at least twice to blend this all out. Now I'm going backwards. I'm going back with my Picked Raspberry, and then my Carved Pumpkin, and then my Squeezed Lemonade. And then I can kind of see any areas that I might need to touch up. But overall, these colors blend pretty well together. Next, I'll remove all of my masks and we will move on to the Copic coloring. I colored her twice. Once for this main image, which I'll show you, and then I flipped around the card and colored her again, that reflection, but I won't show you that. I colored them the same exact way. For her skin tones, I started with my lightest color and mapped out my darkest areas. Next, I'm going in with my E18 and just putting my darkest areas in my shadows. I'll go in with my E15 and blend those shadows out a little bit further. Shadows will be off to the right, being she's kind of facing towards the left, underneath her arm and underneath her little seashells there. Next, I'll go in with my E11 and blend that out even further. And last, I'll go in with my E01 and blend all of that together. Next, for her hair, I know I mentioned this before. These images, these stamps are gorgeous, but I am struggling with the hair. But I'm going to try my best. This one's a little bit easier than yesterday's. Starting off with my darkest color, which is my E59, and just laying out my darkest areas. Where I'm choosing my darkest areas is basically on the top where her little hair is parted, and I'm going to reserve a little bit of a highlight on top of her head. And then I'm going to create some shadows underneath where her arm is, and each piece of her hair, each strand of her hair, I'm trying to make sure that I leave room for my dark, medium, and light. And it's pretty random, to be honest, the little strands that are kind of hanging down further. She's got really long hair. I'm just randomly putting some darker areas in there, no rhyme or reason for it, just to make sure I do have contrast in the end. Here she has that large strand of hair that's kind of hanging over the rest of it, so underneath that strand would pretty much be dark, so there's not going to be much of a highlight there. Once I have my darkest color down, I'll move on to my mid-tone color, my darkest mid-tone color, which I'm sorry, that's off screen a little bit, but it's an E57. And I'm blending those flicks out a little bit further on each side. So if I'm flicking up and down, I'm extending those flicks on both sides. Once my darkest mid-tone was down, I moved on to my lightest mid-tone, which is the E55. I don't know whether I said this was the E57, but that was the E57. This is the E55, extending that out almost all the way, leaving a very, very small area for my lightest color, pretty much just on the tips of her hair and where her little curls are, just in the very center. And my lightest color will be the E53. Like I said, I'm just putting those in just a few little areas. Next, we'll move on to her mermaid tail here. And I wanted this to appear orange. So I'm starting off with a yellow here. This is a Y35. And I'm just laying out where my darkest areas will be, which will be where she's sitting, underneath where she's sitting, basically. And on her little fins on the ends of her tail, I'm concentrating my darkest color being on the top. Being that one little fin is laying over the other, that would create a shadow. So I wanted to make sure that they kind of matched as far as where the highlights and shadows will be. Next, I'll go in with my darkest color and just basically putting a very small line of my darkest color here. Then I'll go in with my darkest mid-tone, flick that out a little bit in some areas, and other areas I'm just extending that line. Then my lightest mid-tone, which is also a YR marker, and finally going in with the Y marker to blend that all out. Now these are pretty different as far as shades go. Normally I wouldn't go in with such a light yellow, but I kind of like the contrast it gives, especially for just something like a mermaid tail. Next, we will move on to the rock that she's sitting on, and I'm going to be using my cool grays for that. First, I just touched up that line that I had wiped the ink off the stamp a little bit too much there. Starting off with my C7, this is my darkest color, just laying out my darkest areas where the one rock is kind of sitting over the other. She would cast a shadow on the rock that she's sitting on. Next, I'll go in with my C5, blend that C7 out a little bit. Then moving on to my C3, blending that out almost to the very edge. These smaller rocks won't really have much of a highlight at all. And then finally with my C1, just adding just a little bit of a highlight off to the left side. For her little seashells here, I'm just using two colors, starting with my darkest color and just blending that out with my V12. This is a V15 and a V12. Now I did color the reflection image the same way. Just an FYI, these are distress oxides. They're not going to blend that well. You kind of get a little muddy in some areas, so you may want to start with your darkest color and almost skip your lightest color, just because you don't want it to be too muddy. Next, I'm stamping my sentiment with VersaFine Onyx Black ink. And I added a little bit of sparkle to her little mermaid tail and fins, as well as her little seashells. I didn't add any other detail. I kind of kept this one simple, but I adhered this to an A2 card, and that's it. Thanks for stopping by, guys. Have a great day.